This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Lloyd. I'm the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of South Australia. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre to our presentation with a Kurdish Iranian writer, journalist, scholar, cultural advocate, filmmaker and former Manus Island detainee, Behrouz Boochani, as he discusses his latest book, Freedom, Only Freedom. But before we kick off proceedings tonight, I would like to first invite Auntie Rosemary Wanganeen to provide a Garna welcome. Rosemary is an award-winning, proud South Australian Aboriginal woman with ancestral links to Garna people of the Adelaide Plains and Wirangu from the west coast of South Australia. With Rosemary's extensive experience in griefology, she founded the Sacred Site Within Healing Centre in 1993, and most recently the Healing Centre for Griefology. Please join me in welcoming Auntie Rosemary.
Thank you very much, David. And Nachala, thank you also to the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre for inviting me to perform Welcome to Garna Country. Could I also take this opportunity to extend a very special acknowledgement to any Aboriginal persons present here today who are of Garna heritage, similarly to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from other traditional lands across our continent. I would also like to acknowledge your distinguished guests. It's also an honour and a privilege to perform Welcome to Garna Country because it gives me an opportunity to formally welcome non-Aboriginal people onto Garna Country. So, when performing Garna welcomes, I love to bring an educational component and for it to be interactive. For example, let me first explain the meaning of the Garna word and then I'll formally welcome you. And because you are a group, I'll be doing a Garna group welcome. I'll ask you, Namani, which sounds a little bit like no money, right? And Namani is simply asking, are you all well? And you'll respond with Mani Adlu. Now, to help you recall Mani Adlu, I have a few images to describe to you to help you remember. So instead of money, it's mani. And steel is not soft, it's ard. And you can probably guess the last one. Lu. So when you say mani ardlu back to me, you're simply telling me we're all well. So I'm about to formally ask you Namani, and I invite you to remember those three images. So on behalf of myself, my Garna ancestors, Namani? Oh, fantastic. So continuing with the educational component, for the city centre of Adelaide, Tandanya is the Garna word for place of the red kangaroo. And many more aren't aware that Garna country is far and wide. So if you imagine a wheel with 9 spokes and the city of Adelaide is the hub, these spokes approximately extend into the following places: Crystal Brook, which is about 2 hours north of Adelaide, then back down in a southeasterly direction into Clare, which is about 1.5 hours from Adelaide. Still in a southerly direction into Gawler, follow the foothills of Mount Lofty Ranges, continuing in a southerly direction to the south coast, to the Fleurieu Peninsula, into Cape Jervis, which is about 1.5 hours from Adelaide. And so to complete the circle, we'll turn around, head north, up the Gulf of St Vincent, pass by Adelaide, pass by Port Wakefield, pass by Port Broughton, pass by Crystal Brook. Furthermore, many aren't aware that the top of Mount Lofty Ranges is the country of the Piramunk people. My welcome always acknowledges my gratitude for the sharing of modern Australia, and from my heart to yours, I'm truly welcoming each and every one of you onto Garna country. However, I also acknowledge my deepest sadness for the human cost to us as Aboriginal people for this sharing. and that our Aboriginal ancestors never ceded sovereignty to our traditional lands, seas and waterways in any part of our civilisation. But realising, and I hope it'll always be, we have a right, a role and a responsibility to be a part of the reconciliation process. We, the adults, need to continue reconciling for the health and well-being of our future generations under our Great Southern Cross. This is reconciliation in action tonight. So as we journey throughout our Australian lives, walking upon Kaurna country, our Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal ancestors ask us to tread ever so gently. Our nation of Australians have many cultural identities, so let's continue recognising each other's humanity so that we can continue moving forward as one nation to a place of equity, justice and in partnership together as contemporary Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians. Equally, our youth, who are our future generations, plead with us to tread ever so gently, and not just upon Kaurna country, but tread even more gently upon Mother Earth, because this is her home, and all living things are just visitors passing through, which includes us, because we're just human. Thank you for being part of the interaction into the Welcome to Kaurna country. Thank you, David, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation between Behrouz and Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy Rosemary, for that wonderful welcome to Kaurna country. We're very, very pleased to see so many people here tonight, and I would especially like to welcome our speaker, Behrouz Boochani, journalist Peter Grest, and book collaborator Dr. Omid Tofighian. I am sure that we will have a wonderful night. We are also welcomed, and recognising that we are welcome, we're joined tonight by Jane Stinson, the MP, the member for Badco. I would, at the offset, like to actually thank Jacinta Thompson, who's the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, and her team, and Renee in particular, for all their work in presenting this exclusive event here tonight in South Australia. Just a bit of a round of applause for that. It is now my pleasure to invite translator, book collaborator and editor Dr. Omid Tofighian to provide an introduction. Omid is an adjunct lecturer in the School of the Arts and Media at the University of New South Wales and an honorary research fellow at Birkbeck Law in the University of London. He's an award-winning lecturer, researcher and community advocate, combining philosophy with interests in citizen media, in popular culture, displacement and discrimination. He has several publications, including the translation of Behrouz Boochani's multi-award-winning book, No Friends But the Mountains, Writings from Manus Prison. Omid's long collaboration puts him in a unique position to bring Behrouz's stories to readers, and tonight he will highlight the plight of refugees from around the world. Please welcome Omid.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to that amazing welcome to country. It's an honour to be here. It's fantastic to see you all here. I'd like to start by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to extend that respect also to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-editor and co-translator, Mansoubi. She's usually here with me doing this short introduction, and unfortunately because of other commitments she wasn't able to be here, but she's been amazing throughout this whole journey. She's been indispensable to Behrouz's work, to my collaborations, and she is Behrouz's first translator. If it weren't for Manus's translations, I would never have found out about Behrouz many, many years ago, and I wouldn't be here with you today. You know, it's really difficult actually to enjoy this moment. We're here, an amazing crowd, a new book. Behrouz is here with us in Australia, no longer just on the screen. I can actually finish an event and then join Behrouz afterwards and socialise and enjoy the moment. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the surreal experience working with Behrouz, and also the element of horror that's also attached to it. And this resonates particularly with this moment, because as we're here in this event with Behrouz joining us, and of course the new book, people in Iran are fighting on the streets for freedom, for their futures, fighting to acknowledge, of course, all the people who have died under this brutal regime over the last 40 odd years. And this is what I mean by this experience being so surreal. It's hard to enjoy this moment. It's hard to celebrate. The very special slogan for this particular uprising in Iran, in Kurdish, is Jin, Jian, Azadi. In Persian, Zan, Zendigi, Azadi. In English, woman, life, freedom. And the philosophy behind this includes struggle, resistance, and the significance and power of women and all oppressed and subjugated human beings. So I want you all to take notice of the flyer that was placed on your seats coming in. A lot of people ask us how we can help, how we can find out more. What can we do? Well, basically, here in Australia, a group of Iranian Australian community organisations have come together to put pressure on the government to make sure something is done on an international level to support the people on the streets fighting for freedom. People who are risking their lives. 4 people have been executed so far. Over 500 have been killed on the streets. In fact, they're the official numbers. We know it's much more than that. And many have been sentenced to death. By checking out the QR codes on this flyer, finding out ways to support, signing letters, contacting your MPs or even higher up, and also find out on an international level what a group such as the National Assembly of Iranian Jurists is doing about this situation. There's many ways to help. This is one step towards that. So I've referred to Behrouz's work as an anti-genre. Throughout his writing and our collaborations, which are about extreme situations and experiences, there is a quality that feels unreal and seems impossible to represent. The grotesque nature of Australia's border industrial complex, in particular the extent of border violence within the immigration detention industry, is clear. This reality is addressed explicitly in Freedom Only Freedom, both in Behrouz's writing and the articles by contributors. But there is a surreal element perpetually penetrating the real experiences. There is a perverse psychological horror pervading the lived experience of detention and also the collaborative work that we do together. There is a strangeness. Engaging in this work is necessary and urgent, but it also feels impossible to grasp, always out of reach. There is something twisted about every aspect. What is it? Behrouz has talked about the soul of the system. Is this feeling evoked by that? Maybe. How do we represent it? This new book, like No Friend But the Mountains and other works, has a logical structure, an analytical approach, and rationale, but not everything about border violence can be grasped intellectually or rationally. There is something deeper there, something absurd and paradoxical that demands that we question and challenge the way we interpret and understand border violence. This work encourages us to hold off on our immediate tendencies to compartmentalize, examine, explain, and reduce. Facts, figures, dates, and other data, rational accounts, they're not enough. How do we account for that surreal factor? The answer to these questions are some of the things we encourage you to look for when reading Freedom Only Freedom. What I appreciate about and respect about Behrouz's work, and something we have tried to emphasize and maintain in our translation and in research, is that he does not strive to justify why he left Iran, why he has struggled so hard to find freedom. He does not appeal to a kind of liberal humanitarianism by trying to convince an audience that he deserves to be treated as a human being. His books, our collaborative works, are not about explaining and asking for respect and justice. He knows who he is and what he stands for. Freedom, only freedom, and No Friend But the Mountains are more about holding a mirror up to power, ignorance, complacency, and outright violence. To finish, I just want to acknowledge the contributors to Freedom, Only Freedom. It's been such an honour for us to work with them all. They address the pivotal themes and issues covered in Behrouz's work. Mansoubi examines both the writing and translation process. Ben Doherty examines the unique form of journalism produced. Jordana Silverstein explores the importance of history. Sajjad Kabghani examines post-humanist discourses in Behrouz's work. Rosa Germian engages with modern Kurdish writing and journalism. Anne McNevin discusses knowledge production. Victoria Canning discusses the experience of systematic torture. Shaminda Kanapathy depicts his account of lived experience. Eric Jensen provides reflections on transcending borders through writing. Elohe Zivardar and Mehran Qadiri deliver a commentary about the Nauru context. Fatima Mirsham addresses embodiment and the environment. Mahnaz Ali Mardanian explores the exploitation of Manus Island and its people. Helen Davidson reflects on political economy and corruption. Claudia Tazraita explains hope as a political act. Stephen Ratuva explores transcultural imaginaries against incarceration. Lida Amiri explains Boochani's dialogic approach and collective activism. Anne Soma provides critical reflections on poetics and narrative. Ariana Grasso offers us important analysis about social media. And finally, Helen Zaveri critiques colonial legacies. Also, thank you Tarajun Winch for her foreword to the book, our publisher Rory Gormley, and Bloomsbury. Jin Jian Azadi, Zan Zendegi Azadi, Woman, Life, Freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Omid, and we look forward to welcoming you back on the stage following Behrouz and Peter's conversation. Now, Behrouz Boochani is a Kurdish Iranian writer. He's a journalist, a scholar, a cultural advocate, and a filmmaker. He was a writer and editor for the Kurdish language magazine Weriya in Iran. He's a visiting professor at Birkbeck Law School, an associate professor in social sciences at UNSW, a non-resident visiting scholar at the Sydney Asia Pacific Migration Centre in the University of Sydney, and an honorary member of PEN International. He is the winner of the Amnesty International Australia 2017 Media Award, the Diaspora Symposium Social Justice Award, the Liberty Victoria 2018 Empty Chair Award, and the Anna Pilotskovsky Award for Journalism. He publishes regularly with The Guardian, and his writing also features in the Saturday paper, The Huffington Post, New Matilda, The Financial Times, and the Sydney Morning Herald. Behrouz is also a co-director of the 2017 feature-length film Choco, I beg your pardon. Please tell us the time. It's the Irish teeth. And a collaborator on the play Manus. His book, No Friends But the Mountains, Writing from Manus Prison, won the 2019 Victoria Prize for literature in addition to the non-fiction category. Tonight, Behrouz will be in conversation with the journalist, academic, filmmaker and author Professor Peter Grest. Peter came to academia in 2018 after a 30-year career as an award-winning foreign correspondent for the BBC, Reuters, CNN and Al Jazeera in some of the world's most volatile places. From Afghanistan to Latin America, Africa and the Middle East, Peter has reported from the front lines and beyond. In 2017, with two colleagues, he established the advocacy group, the Alliance for Journalists' Freedom, which actively campaigns for media freedoms across Australia and the Asia-Pacific region. Peter is the author of The First Casualty, about his own experiences in Egypt and the wider war on journalism. Please join me in welcoming Behrouz Boochani and Professor Peter Grest.
What an extraordinary room to be in today, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me begin by saying it's a little bit intimidating to be sharing the stage with Behrouz. I was last on stage with Behrouz a few years ago at the Byron Bay Writers' Festival, and this was back in 2020, I think it was, and Behrouz at the time wasn't able to be there in person, but he still managed to steal the show with his intelligence, with his charm, with his wisdom and insight. You can imagine how it's going to be this evening. This book is a remarkable piece of Australian writing. It's also an extraordinary document for our country. Of course, it is a work of journalism, but as Omid has so brilliantly articulated in his introductory remarks, it's also a reflection of our own approach to what I think is one of the more shameful aspects of our recent history. Behrouz, Peter Dutton said you and many other refugees would never come to Australia. So let me be the first here this evening to say welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
As Dave mentioned in his remarks as well, of course, I've been through my own rather difficult experience of imprisonment, of unjust imprisonment in Egypt in 2015. And I found this book very difficult to read, not least because there are a lot of things that resonated very powerfully with me. And one of the things that we spoke about in Egypt with a lot of my other prison mates, my cellmates, was the way in which the bodies of prisoners have become the kind of battleground, not just for incarceration, but for politics. It becomes a kind of almost a stage, both for politics by those with power, but also as a form of resistance by the prisoners themselves. Behrouz, that's something that you reflect on in your book. You write about how the bodies become a focus for state violence, but also a place of resistance. What did you understand by that?
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. I think I look at body as a kind of language as well, a language that we use to send a message and also remind of ourselves, that who we are as a human being. In this book and in some articles I mentioned about when refugees use their bodies as a weapon actually to challenge the system. Even in the protest, in the hunger strike, and other thing that sometimes people did self-harm, but in that context it was a political act. For people who follow the stories of refugees in Manus Island and Nauru, you see that, especially in Manus, that most of time in the protest, people are half naked. There are many photos and even photos of me that we are half naked. And that is quite interesting, that how we wanted to send this message that our body is a subject in politics, and in power. It's like a battleground. So that's why, always I look at bodies as a place of resistance as well.
Yeah, hunger strike, we actually considered a hunger strike in Egypt, and we came very, very close on several occasions to starting a hunger strike. I don't think people really understand just how your body is the only thing that you have control over, isn't it, when in prison? It becomes a form of resistance in that regard, where you're exerting control over your body in the only way that you have.
Yeah, exactly. When you do hunger strike, I didn't do that just for 10 days once. but many people did that, and the biggest hunger strike that we had in Manus Island was on 2016. And if we look at the history of resistance, like collective resistance in Manus Island, you see that at beginning, after 6 months, we did a riot. So it was a riot. We forced the guards out, and we took control of the prison. And it was quite violent because the way they attacked us, and then they used local people to attack the detainees, and in the end, Reza Barati was killed, and about 100 people injured. But on 2016, we decided to do a hunger strike, as like a peaceful resistance, because we got a big lesson from our first, act, and we did
the riot.
Yeah, we did and that riot, actually, they dominated that riot on us, they dominated that riot. But on 2016, we did a hunger strike, like at least 700 people did that hunger strike. And, it's very interesting. And later on, many detainees did hunger strike. And still, it's a very common way of resistance in Australia, in the detention industry,
You mentioned self-harm. And in one particularly harrowing place, in one chapter in the book, you write that this is a system that has for years exploited the bodies and souls of human beings and absorbed them into its ruthless logic. These examples of violence within the system represent the spirit of the oppressive overlord. Self-harm is a product of the system. But Peter Dutton blamed human rights groups for self-harm.
In this context, what I said, that is my analysis about self-harm that's happened a lot, almost every day in that place. That violence created by the system, so that violence reflected on, our bodies, on people who did that. So the system produced that violence, because it's very interesting. I read a book by Dostoevsky, and he said something interesting when he was in Siberia in prison, and he said that sometimes prisoners, they are nice for a year, for 2 years, but sometimes they get so violent because of a very small thing, like having salt or sugar in the kitchen, lack of that. For very simple little thing, they get so violent. And that means, by saying that story, I say that this violence, they collected this violence for years, but suddenly, refugees or detainees get, violence on their bodies or against the system. But what Peter Dutton said, that is, I think, the mentality of this system and mentality of people who see refugees less. And that is not only with refugees, with marginalized people. I finish this, that they don't see that refugees as human beings or minorities have agency. They do not recognize that agency. That is the colonialism mentality.
Because it was blaming the human rights groups.
Yeah, exactly.
They coached the refugees to inflict violence on them, to self-harm, so that they could then be evacuated to Australia.
But actually, we were coaching them. We were coaching Australia in many ways.
What do you mean by that? I'm not quite sure I understand.
So the protest, the hunger strike, and all of the works that I did and other people did, in Manus Island, that is my perspective, that we created a body of works, and I call it resistance knowledge that have been created by detainees, And of course, through these books, you see that. So, of course, that effect on, political culture in Australia, that is a kind of contribution to politics and culture in this country, so that's why I believe that that we have been leading some part of Australia, or people who really engage with our resistance.
We'll talk a little bit about the impact of your writing, the impact of that resistance, not just on the political outcomes, the closure of the system is still ongoing, and we'll also talk about that too in a moment. But before we do, one of the things that, again, Behrouz and I talked a few days ago ahead of this, and one of the things that really struck me about coming back to Australia, because I spent 25, 26 years abroad as a foreign correspondent, and I found that Australia is incredibly bureaucratic, far more bureaucratic than the country that I left. One of the features of my imprisonment in Egypt was also to see the way that the bureaucracy had worked to dehumanize the prisoners, and also the way that the bureaucracy, in a lot of respects, I think had imprisoned the bureaucrats themselves. I came to see my own jailers as much prisoners of the system as I was. And Behrouz, you write a lot about the way that bureaucracy dehumanizes refugees. I really resonated with that. What was your understanding of the way that bureaucracy worked?
Yes, so I think that system in Manus Island, I think that is a very original version of this bureaucratic system, that now we have it here as well, Sometimes when we go to do shopping, on these days, when you are in the cafes, sometimes you should order online. That is a very little version of that. But in Manus prison, when you wake up as a detainee, you go through a bureaucratic system for getting a very simple thing, for having food, for...
How did that work?
Yeah, we had to stay in a queue, in a line, and that line sometimes took like 2 hours, and then you had to stay in the line for having lunch, then dinner. And for those people who were sick, actually they were addicted to the pills and tablets that the doctors used to give them. So that, just imagine that prisoner who was sick staying in the line for all of that. And if you wanted to have a shampoo, you had to do that. If you want to have a soap, I don't know, many things, for your daily life. And if you want to have a tablet, because they used to give us malaria tablets, you had to go on the front of the gate. The officer search your body, guide you to a vehicle, get in the vehicle, in the car, then another gate, they search your body, then put you in the car to the medical, then search your body, enter the medical, search your body again before you see a doctor, and you should do it again. And if you do that 3 times per day or 2 times, that's a lot, and for many years, if you live in that bureaucratic system, that, and also living under camera, a camera that always is there. That is a system of control, system of control that make you crazy, you lose your control and you lose your identity, and they call you as a number. So that is just a simple part of it. But when you live through that system for years, of course, that is a systematic torture.
It also, I think, takes away the agency from the people that are involved in the bureaucracy, because the whole system is mechanized. I'm sure a lot of the guards that were processing it were simply saying, well, this is the way we're instructed to do this. It takes away their agency, it takes away their capacity to communicate.
Yeah, exactly. And that is not only about guards, people who engage with this system in any way, even the advocates, even an artist that do a project about this. So when you engage with this, I think you traumatize in the end, because you hear stories. You always are in an environment that you hear terrible stories from the detainees. But for those people who work within the system, as a guard, as a doctor, or anyone who work in that system, they used to work there for 2 weeks, then they used to come to Australia, fly to Australia and be free for 2 weeks, then go back and replace with others. They have been traumatized as well. Of course, there were many of them were obviously violent and racist, but many of them were stuck in the system because of money they used to get, the money they used to get. And just imagine that violence that they experienced, or they dominated on detainees. They take that violence with themselves to Australia, into the society, and to their bed with their lovers, with their children. That is an invisible violence. That is an invisible violence. But with refugees who are in the community now, they seems free. They are carrying that violence as well.
It's a system that's also explicitly designed to dehumanize the refugees. And there was a remarkable moment, I don't know how many of you watched it, the Q&A a couple of nights ago, where Dan Tehan actually named Behrouz. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Just tell us what happened.
As I mentioned before, our name, in that system, they call us by number. So my number was MEG 045. And but I was quite lucky. At the first 6 months, the guards, one of them said, "Oh, he looks like Jesus." Then other guards, they liked that, and everyone called me Jesus. So I'm not a religious person, but I like that, because I didn't like that they called me MEG 45. But after 6 months, the company changed. After the riot, another company came, and no one called me Jesus again.
But the government had also avoided naming you, and in fact I think the Prime Minister sort of said explicitly he doesn't know who you are. The point was not to give you identity.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is the soul of system, to reduce you to a number, to someone that you are nothing. That's their approach. But Peter Dutton, Scott Morrison, Malcolm Turnbull, when they had to mention my name, for example, that time that I ended up in New Zealand, they had to say something. They called me an individual. They didn't want to mention my name at all. But of course, I exist. And I was writing, I was doing work. And so in Q&A, for me was, probably for many people who watched that, I found it meaningful. At least for me, it was meaningful,
That also reminded me of a passage in here. I'm just going to ask you to read this. Down the bottom there.
Which part? This?
From here. From there.
Yeah. My name, which was a part of my identity, was of no use. And all day long, sometimes nobody even once called me Behrouz. I try to attribute a new meaning to the nonsense number with my imagination. For instance, Mr. Meg. but there were many people like me, Meg. What could I do with that rubbish number? Throughout the whole of my life, I had always hated figures and math. But now I was forced to carry this number. It weighed on my soul, and I had no remedy but to bear its heaviness. Yeah, I think it's finished, yeah. So I should mention this, that, I share this story, but the whole resistance by refugees and all of the works that I've done, different kind of works, it's not about my story. I don't like to share my own story. And you see that most of these works are about others, about other detainees, other people who were suffering in that system, And I had to mention that, so that was just, when I say that my number, definitely other people were struggling with that as well.
I understand that, but your story has also proven to be very powerful in helping people identify with what happened, with the policy, with its impact on so many individuals, so many people, with names, with families, with identities. Let's talk about writing for a moment. You were incredibly prolific on Manus, and you wrote a copious number of pieces for newspapers around the world. You wrote your book, No Friend But the Mountains, of course. You produced a film. Why was writing so important for you? How did it help you deal with this situation?
So that system that we were talking about, that it is a system of control, a system which designed to take your identity and also dehumanize you. So against that system, which is a system of control, always you should live under camera and through that bureaucratic system. The best way to challenge it is to be creative. And in the first book, especially in the first book, you see that there are some characters who are interesting characters. The way they dance, dancing, singing, performance, humor, and also the way we created a ceremony for us. We had our own ceremony in our custom. We created our own custom. So all of that help you to resist and bring your identity back. For me, writing and working, that helped me to survive and also to understand the system. When you understand this complicated system, you feel that you are beyond the system. And that is surviveness in my perspective.
That's so interesting. You talk about creativity, and in fact, this is the first time I've actually heard you speak about this, because we in Egypt, we're also actively creative. We often got food wrapped in aluminium foil, and I discovered that the foil would stick quite well, if you smeared it with soap, would stick quite well to the walls, and we made these big foil murals. And as a sort of form of self-expression and resistance. And I remember one day when the guards came in and tore off the murals because they saw it as us claiming our sense of agency and creativity and as a form of resistance. And for me too, the writing was really important. For me, it was a way of processing, as you did, and a way of trying to understand what was taking place, and as a way of articulating that. For you, though, the story became a way of really drawing attention to what was taking place, wasn't it?
Yeah, of course. It was fighting, and it still is that. It's like that. Yesterday I was in the parliament, and I did a speech there towards some media and staff and some politicians who were there. And I discussed that with Senator Nick McKim. I told him that this visibility is important. It's then, secondly, what I say. What is important, that now I am here and I am talking. That is, that make our resistance visible. Sometimes that visibility, it's a big challenge for that power structure. So, for example, Peter Dutton said that, but I was there, you know.
Yes.
So who knows? Might he was, I don't know, he hide himself that doesn't see me. It's and you know that visibility. So through this writing, through these works, we were still out of Australia, and the whole policy design in a way that people be out of sight and mind. So that's why I think that visibility is important. I think that was not an answer to your question.
No. I think it was it's a very powerful answer.
Yeah.
I mean, visibility was the thing, I think, that helped draw, I was going to say close the system, but the system hasn't been closed, but at least forced the government to scale it back and to recognize that it was untenable, that it was a system that couldn't continue.
But for many years, we always forced them to lie. I think that lie, we used to do something in Manus Island, and that would come to the media, and the system had to lie. And I think still that was a reflection on our resistance.
The fact that they...
Yeah, they were lying. They had to...
Push them into a corner.
Yeah, exactly. For example, how Scott Morrison was lying in those years when he was immigration minister, and later on Peter Dutton and Malcolm Turnbull. He said, I don't know this person, for example, you know, or for people who killed in Manus Island. Many stories that we forced them to lie. But in the end, I think people of Australia, I found it incredible that before the federal election, people of Australia started to talk about that how Scott Morrison is a liar. And we said, we say that many years.
This book is indisputably a work of journalism, but it's really not like any piece of journalism that we're used to seeing. Omid, in his introductory remarks, said that this is not just a work of journalism, but this is a blend of a whole host of different types of writing. What were you trying to do with your journalism?
As Omid mentioned before about the soul of system, that was very important for me, that people understand that or feel it, feel that how life is in through that system, and how this system is complex, how this system, that invisible violence that I always talk about it, that was key for me. And also try to include some part of this policy that often people or humanitarian organizations or journalists or media didn't see it or didn't want to talk about it. For example, indigenous people in Manus Island, they were a part of this policy, this story, and the island damaged, economy damaged. People think that money that they spend in Manus and Nauru that is good for the local people, but actually that imbalanced economy, like a traditional economy that was there, culturally damaged them, their small community, damaged the environment. And then suddenly with that economy that they created, they left. And that created a huge kind of the dynamism, that between their community, and no one talk about them. We don't know what's happened to them. So in this book and in my works, I tried to write about, include them in this discourse. That's why some of the articles are about, particularly about local people, Manusian people, and in my movie, Choka Please Tell Us the Time, that I made on the phone with Arash Kamali Sarvestani, that movie is mostly about Manusian people. And we gave them this space to share their ideas, that how they are angry at Australia, and that is the take us to history of colonialism in this country, mentality of colonialism in this country. That you use their land as a cage, as a land of exile, without asking them.
We don't, as Australians, think of ourselves as colonialists.
I think many people do. Yeah.
But you talk about the history of colonialism, about that colonialist mentality. It's something that historically, culturally, we don't regard ourselves that way. We think of the British as colonialists, but not Australians as colonialists.
I think the way, so of course, I'm not eligible to talk on behalf of Aboriginal people here, but generally, what I experience in Manus Island, the way Australia is treating Pacific nations, the way Australia used those islands as a land of like rubbish bin. They look at refugees as a rubbish and look at those Pacific islands as a rubbish bin. That's what Australia does, That's my experience. And I come from Iran. I know that. I'm Kurdish. I know that. I grew up in a colonialism system. I understand this. When I came to Australia, I faced liberal democracy, but with a strong colonialism mentality and approach. The way Australia treats those countries. I look at Australia in Manus Island as like an octopus. To take control of those islands and, use them as a land of exile and cage and other things they do. I don't have that. I don't have enough knowledge about it, I'm sure. So that is something that we cannot deny that.
Another of the ideas that you raise in your book is the way that governments harness institutionalized language, and I guess the language of colonialism is a really important part of that. And I think because we live this, because it's a part of our discourse, we're not really conscious of the way in which the language shapes our thinking, shapes our political and cultural responses to these things. George Orwell, of course, famously wrote about this in his essay, Politics in the English Language, and it's something I often direct my journalism students to, and I urge anyone in here who's interested in this stuff to seek it out. Can we talk a little bit about the way that the Australian government used language to explain, to justify, to perpetuate, to continue the system of detention?
when I visited, I ended up in New Zealand. So I ended up in Christchurch, a city that terrorists killed many people there. And in an event there, when I was there, I say that, of course, that happened for many reasons, but one of the reasons or the roots of this terrorist attack is in Manus Island in Nauru. Because for many years, in Australian media, in the governments, politicians like Scott Morrison, when he was immigration minister, and before that, and that probably has started from John Howard when he stand up in the parliament and say that we decide who come to this country, and I think it was in 2001. For 2 decades at least, a part of Australian media and the governments and politicians, they have created a language, a propaganda against refugees, against foreigners, and of course that ended up in something crazy like what that terrorist did in Christchurch. I don't say that the whole reason is that, but I mean everything is linked in this context. The way they create a picture about refugees, that they are attacking our country, they are evil, they are drug dealers, they are potential terrorists. So of course, when you use that language for 2 decades, for a decade, that creates that picture.
It makes it possible.
Yeah, that makes it possible. So that's why, the language that I use in my work, in that context, was a language that I wanted to decolonize the language about refugees and about Manus. That's why I called Manus as a Manus prison, but they call it offshore processing center. It's so stupid. You keep people there in that place, torture them, kill them, and keep them for years.
Locked up,
and you call it offshore processing center. That is only one example.
This is a really good point to bring back Omid onto the stage, because Omid, I think, really sits at that intersection of your writing in Farsi, in Persian, and the way in which language was politicized, or the political language had been used. Omid, just come on stage. Omid, as a translator, I know that Behrouz is writing in very, very precise language. Behrouz is clearly very, very thoughtful.
Always I try to write simple. Yeah, simple is better. Yeah.
Try translating that.
Simple is also powerful. But I mean, let's just pick up the point that Behrouz was making just now, that word prison. The government talked about them as offshore processing centres. You could have translated that word as how did you handle that word? I mean, the word prisoner is loaded with meaning. Detainee, you could have used a word like detainee.
This is a really excellent question, and often when conversations begin about the translation process, I think to myself, a whole book needs to be written about how something like No Friend But the Mountains, and now this new book was translated because it's so complicated. So I think what's important to acknowledge is that while I was translating, Behrouz was writing. So many of his writings, especially the ones in this book, were written in real time. So they were written while the events were taking place. And many of them were being translated on the same day or the day after. So, and while I was translating, something else was being written. So we were in discussion pretty much every day during those moments, those periods. And
were you aware of the need to or the politics of the language?
Absolutely. I think what happened was that alongside the translation process were really deep philosophical discussions, intellectual discussions. At a certain point, his theorizing, his analysis was affecting my translation. And then my translation, my decisions, my reflections on the translation and on the original were then impacting on his writing. So there was this back and forth going on. And at a certain point, I started to get a clearer picture about what he's trying to say and what he's trying to unpack, critique. So for instance, with your excellent example of Manus prison, I realized that what he's trying to convey here, of course, he talks about it as a prison, but at the same time, it's so much more than a prison. So in a prison, you need to go through a court process, you need to be charged, you need to be, there's a whole different sort of set of, there's a mechanism in place, there's certain rights that you have, certain restrictions, whereas with the detention centre, with Manus prison, there are elements of it that are like a prison, but there are also elements of it that are completely beyond that. And there are things that happen in there that maybe won't happen in a normal prison. So I realized at a certain point that Manus prison is a whole new phenomenon. So when you put the two together, it's a new concept, and it's part of a larger ecosystem of knowledge.
Let's talk about one of the examples that you mentioned earlier when we were discussing this. One of the really subtle ways of thinking about your translation process. And you mentioned a passage that Behrouz was writing about in No Friend But the Mountains, when he was trying to find space on board the boat that they were in. Can you just talk us through that?
Yeah, I really appreciated your reflections and your suggestions for what to talk about today, and it just immediately reminded me of that section in No Friend But the Mountains when Behrouz is describing his experience in Indonesia, boarding the boat. I think it was on the first journey that ended up in disaster, almost drowning, and he gives this, he explains what it's like to enter that boat and everyone really scrambling to find a safe place, really thinking about their survival, how they're going to endure this journey. And there's hardly any room on the boat, and a certain number of people find a very small area to occupy and to lie down. And Behrouz reflects on that. He's watching this take place, and he says, even in situations like this, on a broken down boat, an old boat, human beings fight over or struggle over a place or a spot. And I could have translated...
What was the word that he was using in Farsi?
I can't remember exactly, but ja, which can be translated many ways, which is like spot, location, place, area. But I decided, I knew what he was trying to say. And, again, going back to our long conversations, I realized he was using this metaphorically, this example. So he's trying to make, it was a commentary also about geopolitics, about humans and their, and power and control. And then it leads into, other things that would happen in his story. So I translated that word ja, I think it was ja, as territory. Human beings struggle over territory. And that reflects the many layers of meaning that are behind these stories.
That is very interesting. I should. It's the first time I hear that from you. I'm very glad that you got it. That comes from my background I'm an academic background because I studied geopolitics in the university, and also I'm Kurdish. Always place, border, and land has been a big concept in Kurdistan, big political concept, and others have been fighting to take control of our land, or our land is like a subject, or our people are fighting to, protect that territory. So that comes from there.
Exactly.
That comes from there. Yeah. It's very interesting. Yeah. Very.
In fact, in your essay at the beginning of the book, you wrote, in addition to Persian literature and cultural political history and elements of indigenous Manusian knowledge and heritage, Boochani's indigenous Kurdish heritage plays a crucial role. The history of Kurdish resistance, creativity, and intellectual life informs the collaborative works in this book and earlier projects.
When I was reading the first few pages of No Friend But the Mountains in Persian or Farsi, I realized there's a lot that I'm familiar with. There was references or somehow reflection of examples from Persian literature, Persian history, politics, but then there were many things that I wasn't familiar with. For instance, I had to do a lot of research about Manusian knowledge systems and customs, and of course the history. I also had to do a lot of research into Kurdish intellectual history, modern Kurdish literature, Kurdish struggle, the plight of the Kurdish people, and also the current political situation. So on top of that, I had to also delve into Behrouz's very the particularities of growing up in Ilam, in particular his village. So there were so many things that he learned from his mother about the environment in Kurdistan, things that were very specific to that place, that again going back to place. So all of these things had to go into the translation, or else there would have been gaps.
And that's a hell of a burden to carry for a translator.
It was, but at the same time it was exhilarating. And I can say that there are two things that my translation is characterized by. One of them is a shared philosophical activity. There is almost like a collective intentionality, or a merging of two identities coming together in translation. And the second one is experimentation, literary experimentation. So I'm not trained as a translator. I came into translation because of my activist work. And so much of my translation work is really pushing the boundaries.
You mentioned...
I'm sorry, I should add something to what Omid said about, of course, Kurdish language, Kurdish background, resistance, and I as a Kurdish. But I think Persian literature is important in that context as well, because I educated... We have to in Iran. Kurdish language is not a formal language in Iran, so everything is about Persian. So we have to go read and study in Persian, and of course that affect on us. So, but Persian literature has a long history.
It's incredibly rich.
And it's rich, it's a rich language, is a rich culture and rich tradition, and very poetic. Farsi language is very poetic, and it's a beautiful language, but of course I have a challenge with that language because they dominated that language on me, but I cannot deny that. So I think that exists in this work as well. I cannot ignore that Persian language and history of literature, that definitely impact on my work.
Omid spoke about almost a dialogue between you and he, and in the whole process of translation as a way of, as a process of communicating back and forth between the two of you. That's not the way that translators would normally work. It's normally you're taking a finished piece and then you are simply converting it into a different language. How was that relationship for you, Behrouz?
The process was like this. So for the articles, that was quite different. But with the nothing about the mountains, I had to, put them together or send them as a message to Manus. And
so you wrote them on your mobile phone?
Yeah, on my mobile phone.
Text messages.
So just I have like a poetic image about it, that these words were flying, from that prison to Australia and get together and became a book.
It's a beautiful image.
Yeah, I didn't feel safe with the authorities anytime they could come. And they did that many times. They raided our rooms, they attacked us. 2 times they took my phone, and I had to struggle to smuggle another phone in. But unfortunately, I was a smoker, and I had to collect cigarettes to exchange with local officers. So that was a difficult process. Yeah, because
giving up cigarettes.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I forgot your question.
No, that's okay. But look, one of the things we mentioned, and this is a lot of the conversation is focused around power and the power dynamics. And you mentioned that the relationship with Omid was much more collaborative, was much more kind of meeting of equals. Can you talk a little bit about about why that worked?
Yeah, of course. I and Omid, we always had the long, intellectual exchange. But in the same times, I was in touch with some others as well. So that environment, later on when I came out, I realized actually that was important, not only for writing and for understanding of the system, but for surviveness, how to survive. Because in that place, when you had to experience and endure violence in a system that dehumanized us, of course, when you have such a conversation like that with someone out of the prison, that help you to feel that your identity back or your dignity back. So for me, everything in that context means resistance.
Of course, you talk about it as resistance, but it also involved a great deal of risk. In the early stages, you kept your name out of the articles. Journalists often referred to you simply as a source. In the end, though, you agreed to have your name being published. Did you feel it was worth the risk? Identifying yourself as the source of
Definitely, because at least 14 people have been killed in that system. And we don't know, they didn't investigate those deaths. There is not independent investigation about this death. And of course that could happen for me, but for me it was strategically, I wanted that they don't mention my name for 2 years until I become sure that I've created a network. Who knew me? No one in Australia when I ended up in Manus. So it took time for me to communicate with people, find the right people. For example, Ben Doherty from Guardian, we were working together. Of course, if something would happen for me, he wouldn't stay silent. So the system had to pay a cost if something happened. But after 2 years, when I became sure that I am safe, so it was like a building something, and then suddenly I just came up. Yeah.
Did you feel as though there was a risk associated with your translation for Behrouz? Were you concerned about the consequences of the work that you were translating?
I think I mentioned in my introduction that I met Behrouz, I found out about Behrouz after reading one of Manus's translations. And that article in The Guardian was Behrouz's first article where he used his real name. And at that point, after discussing the whole experience up until that point with Behrouz, he said, I realized that whether they know me, my identity is out in the open or not, it makes no difference. It's not going to change my situation. I think for a time he was trying to understand the system, work out what the risks are, what the limitations are, what buttons he can press, what he can't. And I think at a certain point he realized that it makes no difference whether he follows the rules or he doesn't, whether he uses one method or another. It's not going to affect his status. It's not going to change his circumstances. And I think at that point, really, he saw, and I began to realize that we're dealing with a system that's extremely complicated. It's something that has roots in Australia's colonial history. It's morphed and merged and replicated into new island prisons. It's something that exists or has examples right throughout the history of Australia with different kinds of camps, different kinds of incarceration. And also, here's what's important to realise as well. I think not long after, maybe less than a year after we started working together, there was a ruling in PNG in the High Court that the detention centre, the prison, is illegal and unconstitutional. And at that point, they couldn't stop people from having phones. They opened the doors. They left the doors open, and they couldn't. They couldn't stop people from having phones. And this is what I mean about it being a prison, but also it's beyond a prison. It's more complex than a prison. You can see all the paradoxes, and I think surrealism is one of the best ways to try to explain it.
I think I should add something about this. I think racism by the system, that they see us less, that helped me as well. Because they didn't think that I can be a challenge for the system, or I am capable to expose the system. But some part of the system was extremely stupid as well. They did, yeah.
Some part?
No, some part is smart as well, but of course it's evil, but they are smart as well. They know what they are doing, it's design.
I think also, from my perspective, I also wrote a lot from prison, and I came to feel that not being identified meant that I was also aiding that system of dehumanization, that being identified with the story, owning the story, forced the authorities to confront who I was as well and who I represented. And I think in your case that was also really key, because it changed the way that Australians understood what was taking place. We came to see not just Behrouz Boochani, but so many others that were human beings as a part of that system, not just merely asylum seekers, queue jumpers, refugees.
But that image about refugee, the word refugee is very powerful. They see you less. That's why when I came to Australia, they asked me, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm a journalist. I came from Iran." And then they just laughed at me, because they see you less.
Yes.
They see you less, and that gave me a kind of safety as well at beginning, until I built my network, and it was just out of control.
Omid, you wanted to jump in? Just
very quickly, I don't think we should underestimate the power of naming, and what that does in the imaginary, in the social imaginary. So, by Behrouz naming the prison, Manus Prison, that in itself is a way of taking control of it, to say that you're not you don't incarcerate me. I take you under my control. I give you a name, and his name going out into the public, becoming international, that in itself was a political act, and also contributed to a whole new way of imagining the situation in the resistance. Another thing that I think is important is he named the system. Like he almost gives the system agency by giving it an identity. In Persian or Farsi, he calls it System Hakem, and again, this is a very complicated translation process, but we decided on the name in English, the Kyriarchal system. So this act of naming, I think, is philosophically as well very powerful.
Well, I think one of the reasons we've got more than 1,000 people in this room is because of the name Behrouz Boochani.
Yeah, thank you.
We are almost out of time, but I am going to ask you, Omid, to read just one passage. It's not a particularly political passage overtly, but to me it's one of the most beautiful passages in the book. And it also, I think, tells us something fairly profound about the place and the experience. Just read this, please.
Absolutely. Untitled by Behrouz Boochani. Here, in the neighbourhood of the people who stare for 24 hours solely at walls and metal, the presence of animals is a virtue. That flock of birds gliding at night under the dramatic moon creates a magical and striking scene in our minds. So too, the orchestra of frogs that have no home except a lagoon that clings to the ocean, shunning the ocean as they grow old. The eldest crabs sink into the damp mud under the fences and after a while drift into a deep sleep. Slithering under the fences, curious snakes sometimes enter the prison like strangers and usually lose their lives for their innocent trespass. When the unique fish-eating eagle with a white neck dives into the ocean bed, it catches a big fish. Colourful parrots love to hold their family, gathering on the tallest coconut trees. Here, animals are the finest elements in the mind of a lonely prisoner who has no interests but the sky, the ocean, and the jungle, all beyond the fences.
Ladies and gentlemen, Omid Tofighian and Behrouz Boochani.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You guys can stay there for a second. Thank you, Behrouz. Thank you, Omid. Thank you, Peter. It falls to me now to deliver a vote of thanks to Behrouz and to all of you for the generous gift of this conversation. And I want to say thank you for the time that you spent with us tonight. Thank you for challenging us with your insight to an aspect of this country that so many Australians do not like to spend time contemplating. It's an aspect that's so difficult to acknowledge or accept. It's a tacit complicity in the dehumanisation of others. Thank you for allowing us to sit with that discomfort, to reflect on it and to acknowledge it, and to accept it. Thank you for the awe that we feel when we're contemplating how you could draft a prize-winning book, No Friend But the Mountains, by sending text messages while incarcerated in Manus prison, not in some offshore processing centre. And thank you for infecting us with your secret weapon, the greatest weapon that any human can wield, the weapon of hope. Having been very plainly told once that you would never set foot in Australia, here you are. You're leaving your footprint on our country through your activism, and you've generously visited us again to carry the burden of helping us all to understand the inconvenient truth of your experience. Thank you for allowing us, everyone here in this room, everyone who'll read your book, to recognise your existence. Thank you for allowing us to see you for who you are. As a journalist, you not only report on your experience as a refugee, as a detainee, as a prisoner, but you work to help Australians to truly understand the brutality of a system which we created and which has fostered the violence that you suffered, the violence that we can see and the violence which is invisible. You've helped us to understand the damage that that system has done, not only to individuals like you who were imprisoned within the system, but to us and to our nature's culture. The conversation that we've had here tonight gives us pause to reflect once again on the purpose of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre: to strengthen democracy, to value diversity, to build the future. Behrouz, Omid, Peter, tonight you three have truly contributed to this mission with everything you've shared with us. And I do encourage everyone here tonight to continue to engage with your work. So thank you three very much from all of us one more time. And thank you all for attending here tonight on behalf of the Hawke Centre. We do look forward to seeing you at another event very soon. Thank you. Good night.